And welcome back to Music Free Static. I hope you're having a fabulous day. And I was talking to my daughter the other day, and we were just chatting about stuff. We ended up swapping stories about RPG campaigns that we played in, whether it was D&D or Rifts or things like that. And then uh, later, sitting down watching episode 4 of Agatha All Along, and there's a scene where a number of members of the coven are just swapping stories and bonding and stuff. And that got me thinking, what is it about stories that draws people together? I mean, seriously, what is it? Right? I mean, human history is built on stories, right? That you had oral histories and songs going way back, predating the written word, right? They're often stories. And then you've got things like Greek mythology, which is just full of stories of gods and goddesses doing stuff, right? You look at the Bible, and Christ is sharing the message of the gospel through parables, which are stories, right? So, what is it about stories that brings people together, right? And, it's weird because you look at how many shared experiences and stories that come from communities and helps bring the community together, right? And it doesn't matter how big the community is. It could be the size of a city. It could just be a friend group, right? Right? How many times have you sat down, or just your friends have been together and talked about, hey, that one time when, right? Or you have you've got a town with people that have survived a disaster, and they'll talk about that disaster and what it does to bring the community together. Not that everything is positive necessarily, but the fact that they survived that disaster and have the story does bind a community in a lot of ways. And you see this actually in some ways with COVID experiences, right? Yeah, whether it's, yeah, you'll hear people talk about, oh yeah, I was basically locked by myself in my apartment for a year and a half or something, right? We all sort of understand those types of experiences, and it can bring us together, right? Because we understand where they're coming from, because we were also there, right? And it's interesting, like Star Trek The Next Generation played with this in an episode called Darmok, right? Enterprise meets another race, uh, and there's communication issues. Well, what they find is that the species they are talking to, their entire language and their culture is built off the idea of a shared background in stories, right? They communicated by citing example and metaphor, I think is how Picard put it. And so you see those, like, Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra has a specific meaning that that species understood, but was gibberish to the Enterprise and her crew. They, of course, throughout the story, you then learn that, oh yes, they take that shared cultural knowledge of stories and turn that into everything about communication, right? Now, I have some quibbles with that, but the concept was sort of interesting. But think about things a little bit too. Like when we often see people who frequently, and I fall into this boat, quote TV shows or movies or books, right? But think about what that means, those quotations, right? So, for example, in the Avengers, when I said that Loki had turned a bunch of Shield agents into his personal flying monkeys, Steve Rogers has this outburst of, "I understood that reference," right? Now it's played for laughs, as Rogers is the man out of time and frequent and just recently returned, right? Hasn't had a chance to do a lot of catch up yet. But that shared culture brings us together, right? When they talk about flying monkeys, most of at least American culture understands the reference to the Wizard of Oz and the monkeys that became the servants of the Wicked Witch of the West, right? But we have the same type of thing if somebody comes up and says, "No, I am your father." Everyone sort of knows that, right? They know that quote from Star Wars, right? Often they misquote it, but they know it, right? So all of that sort of brings people together, and it doesn't matter. So it could be fiction, and we're all sort of bonding over a book. It could be real life events, right? And people just swapping stories of, well, let's say we just had a hurricane just wipe out a chunk of the southeast U.S. But people talk about tornadoes that go through. Heck, when I was, I don't know, it was sometime in the 2000s. I'm trying to remember the exact date now, 2008 maybe. The city I live in suffered from poisoned water supply. Not deliberately poisoned. We had salmonella in the water supply. And yeah, there was a lot for a long time. Talk about that, and it sort of brought people together as we were all recounting our experiences. Now, when I was growing up, my dad would often tell me stories about things that happened at work. Now, my dad was a cop for 31 years, so it's not like he was telling me stories about, oh, I sorted a spreadsheet. No, he was a cop, and he had a lot of fun stories of his time on the force. And we were talking about it at one point. He says, yeah, he told me those stories in part so that I wouldn't be so worried about him going to work and being a cop, because I was little, right? But I also learned a lot about those stories about who he was and some of his experiences and stuff. But it's funny. So, I want to read a story here to you. This was real short. Trust me, it's okay. This is one that he wrote down sort of to help people remember these stories. And I asked him to do this because so much of what I know of my dad came from these stories, okay? But there's more to this. So hang in there with me. But he says, myself and another cop named Ray had a radio call of a burglary in progress. When we arrived on the scene, we were met by the complainant. He reported that he saw a man and a woman break into a vacant house across the street from his home. We entered the house and found it completely empty of furnishings. We checked the first and second floor and found nothing. The complainant was insistent, saying he'd been watching the house and they had not left. He told us the back door was nailed shut. We checked, and sure enough, it was nailed tight. We asked him if he knew of any crawl spaces or basement. He told us there was no lower level spaces, but there was an attic. We went up to the second floor and saw a small hatch in the ceiling, about 8 feet off the floor. We doubted anyone could be up there, but decided to pop the hatch using my nightstick and try to illuminate something with my flashlight. I got ready to pop the hatch, and Ray backed into a bedroom, hoping to get a better angled view. As I knocked the hatch upward, we heard a scurry of sound and a crash right above Ray's head, which showered him in plasterboard and insulation. 2 feet protruded from the ceiling on either side of the beam of a beam, and we heard a man groan and a woman giggle. Ray drew his revolver and took a dead beat on one of the feet and ordered the people down. The male lowered the woman down and then came down holding his racked groin. We handcuffed them and walked them out to the patrol car. Only after we got them inside the car did we break down in laughter. Ray's uniform was a mess. His hair was gray with plaster, and he was trying to get pieces of insulation that had fallen down his neck. At headquarters, we asked the man what they were doing. He told us they were just looking for a place to make love. I asked him when he fell through the ceiling and racked his groin. Did it hurt? He says, yeah, it hurt. He says, yeah, she laughed. He says, yeah. Okay, now, It's a story's a lot more fun when Dad tells it. Didn't get a lot of the humor and stuff into the story, but you could just imagine, right? They're in the house and suddenly crash. The guy just racks himself falling through the ceiling. Okay, there's something funny there, right? This is the basis of comedy, slapstick comedy throughout the ages, right? Now, I told you that story to tell you this one. 3 years ago, not quite 3 years ago, my dad died, and we held a memorial. Now, I hate funerals, so when I held a memorial, what I did is I basically held a get together so we could sit and chat and talk and tell stories and reminisce about my dad. And so there were a number of cops that showed up in the memorial, and I was telling the story of one of the things that, because Dad told me a bunch of these, and I was telling the story, and one of the cops there perked up and said, "Hey, that was me. That was Ray from the other cop in the story." I never thought I'd meet the dude, right? I'd heard this story so many times. And there he is. I met the guy. And we spent a lot of that time swapping stories about my dad, right? It was a chance to help bring us together. And that's the thing. Stories can help build connections, right? And it doesn't matter. It's like some of that is, oh yeah, like in this case, oh, I was there. Or the whole, I said, that's got a whole book of these stories, but it helped me understand my dad in a way that I don't think I would have just talking to him. Okay. But when you look at other stories that people tell, right, they help build sort of this empathy and understanding sometimes, right? So I'm listening to a podcast called Why We Can't Have Nice Things. And it uses stories of people to build a foundation, in this case for analysis of government healthcare policies. But, and I'm not going to get into the politics of it, though I highly recommend Why We Can't Have Nice Things by Eric Bain, I think is the guy's name. It's put out by the Reason Foundation. So you can find that. But while I give that as an example, it's not the only one. You look at a lot of, anytime you see a quote unquote in-depth news story, something on the news, you'll see all of this framed around a story, right? So-and-so can't do something because of, right? And then they use that because of then to tell the story that they want to tell. Why this law is a problem or not, or, whatever, which is often the case when you read these news stories, is they'll go in deep about how some law is doing something or other. Okay. It's, it's common, but you also talk about, or see that in so many other situations, right? So one of the things that happens for me as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is twice a year we have General Conference. Okay. And what General Conference is, it's basically over the course of 2 days, we've got 5 roughly 2-hour sessions. They're never more than 2 hours. Sometimes they're a little shorter, of talks by the general officers of the church. Okay. Fine. But often the speakers will tell a story, right? They'll tell somebody's story and then use that to as sort of a lead into a discussion of a gospel principle. Okay. And yes, it happens in General Conference. It happens at pulpits around the country. Okay. Not just within the LDS church, any church where you've got somebody who, a pastor or a priest or somebody who's giving a sermon, you'll see these types of things. Why? Because stories bring us together, right? They help us have empathy for the people in the story. They help us build connections with each other and the subject, right? But also think about how stories bring people together just because of the story, right? And this is what happens with fandom, right? People love Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or Twilight or whatever. Pick something. And as soon as two fans realize the other person is a fan, they absolutely bond over that, right? And they start going in all about how Han shot first, or what was Luke's endgame when he threw down his lightsaber in Return of the Jedi, or was Luke wrong, when he was thinking that the Jedi should end? Okay, the text of the movie says, yes, Luke was wrong. But understanding why he got there, right? You start having these discussions, and that can be fun. You start bringing all of those people together, right? That is fun. That's amazing. When all that clicks, that's great. There's a reason there are fan clubs and get-togethers, right? The 501st, in the Star Wars community, the 501st is a group of Star Wars cosplayers. It started with people who were building screen-accurate Stormtrooper costumes. Okay. And it starts going on with some others, but it started with Stormtrooper costumes. And the 501st has some very strict rules about what works for screen-accurate costumes. And they are so good that Lucasfilm, right, the company behind Star Wars, right, would often bring in the 501st for special events, right? They'd have some announcement, or right, they'd have some big thing on stage, and often it was members of the 501st who would show up on stage as stormtroopers, or who would march through as stormtroopers. And heck, I think I was listening to the Force Center podcast, and I think one of them, Jennifer Landa, I think, was talking about her wedding and how they had a couple of members of the 501st as stormtroopers at the wedding. Okay, that's awesome. Go Jen, right? And then it just expanded out. They've got a Mandalorian group and they've got a Rebel group, right? But so much of that community is the community, right? It's bringing people together. Why? Because of a story, right? Because of their love of a story, right? You start thinking about what do stories have? What sort of impact do these stories have on culture, right? You think about our culture, and how do the fact that we're all telling these stories, all right, how does that impact us? Right? A lot of times you get things like, you get a common cultural zeitgeist, right? A cultural understanding, a pool of cultural references, I guess, right? And sometimes, even if people aren't necessarily a fan of, say, Star Wars, they still understand when somebody talks about a Jedi mind trick, okay? Because it's just part of culture now, right? These stories in general, and I said it doesn't matter if it's books, right? People talk about Shakespeare or Star Wars or anything in between, right? Pride and Prejudice or whatever, right? That background brings people together. Now, it can also drive people apart, okay? And this is the issue I have with toxic fandom, because as much as I love Star Wars, and as much as I would love to talk to other people about Star Wars and deep themes and meanings, and right, so much of the fandom is just toxic. They just spew hate, okay? So that kind of sucks. But the overall impact, though, is we all know what a Jedi mind trick is. We all know what a lightsaber is. Okay? Even people who've not seen Star Wars know what these things are because it's just so much, it's so baked into our culture, right? Heck, even the line, I'll be back, right, was used so often by Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, from Terminator to just about everything else, that people understand those references, right? To go back to Steve Rogers and the Avengers, I understood that reference. Right? And that brings all of that background and meaning and all of that, right? It's one reason I love movie quotes, and I have a number of them that are available. Sometimes I play them when I stream because we get all of it in sometimes just one line, right? And sometimes it's just fun, right? Like, I love the movie Spaceballs. It's not a fabulous movie by any stretch of the imagination, but I find it hilarious, especially because I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and it riffs on Star Wars a lot, right? I grew up watching sci-fi in the 80s and 90s, and oh yeah, it hits all the tropes. But having that quote play, evil will only triumph because good is dumb, right? You hear that, okay, yep, this was great. Or from Big Hero 6, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your pain, right? You just understand, right? You start getting all of that background of the story, right? And it sort of brings you together, and not just because the line is funny or whatever, but because that shared experience brings us together. And I said I've wondered over the years, why do humans tell stories? Right? Because humans are a storytelling species. We just tell stories. We do it a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people have gotten into role-playing games over the last few years. I mean, aside from the fact that they're just fun a lot of the time, I think people are craving stories. I mean, I was reading a study. I was reading about it last week, but the study was basically said, and I forgive me, I forgot the exact dates, but it was talking about like in the 80s-ish, I think it was, may have been earlier. Again, forgive me if I have the dates wrong. I'm just pulling this out of my wee little mind. But back in the day, it said something like 70% of high school graduates had read a book in the last year. And now currently, like, the numbers have flipped. Like 70% of students have not read a book in the last year. Okay. Now, one could go on a diatribe about the failings of the American education system. This is not the place for it. But I think that might be a lot of it is people are craving stories. And so, yeah, they're going to Dungeons and Dragons, but they're also going to true crime podcasts and just so many other sources of stories, because people like stories, right? And I said, these sort of shared experiences, I think, are bringing us together. And it helps build communities. It helps build culture, right? Just look at any fan convention, okay, and look at the community that's there. And it doesn't matter if it's Star Wars or Star Trek or Twilight or Stargate or the collected works of Jane Eyre, right? Take your pick. But look at what happens with these communities, right? Look what happens when they come together. The friendships that are made, the connections that are made, right? all of this is amazing. And that's not even getting into the content of the stories, right? All right. Because how many times have you read a story and actually been emotionally touched by the story, right? So much so that it's like, yes, I am definitely connecting with this in some way, right? Oh yeah, totally. Happens to me often, right? I mean, I love The Last Jedi, Star Wars The Last Jedi. A lot of people hate it. Okay, we can disagree. And their opinions of a movie are their opinions, and their opinions are not wrong about whether they liked it or not. That cannot be disproven. If they say they didn't like it, they didn't like it. Cool. But I was touched by Luke's story, talking about how he thought the Jedi needed to end because of his failures. And as a middle-aged guy who's definitely had his share of failures in life, I understood where Luke was coming from. Disagreed with him, yes, but understood him? Absolutely. Right? These are the types of things. Heck, Rey's story in that movie gets me too, is she's now part of a larger world and doesn't know how she fits in. Oh yeah, been there. Now, the movie talks about her power with the Force and trying to understand how to use it and what it is. But if you replace the Force with adulthood, oh yeah, that is everybody's story in a lot of ways, right? I'm now an adult. I now have this power. I'm in a world full of people, and I don't know where I fit. I don't know how to fit. I don't know how to use this power of adulthood, right? Oh yeah, 100% I get that, right? So, yeah, stories are amazing, right? They help us. Is that understanding, I think, can't be overstated as well, because you listen to those stories, okay? I think this is one of the reasons that Jesus taught in parables, is people understood the parables. Okay, the people at the time of Christ understood when he was talking about the parable of the sower and the seeds that were planted or fell by the wayside and all this. They understood that because that was life, right? And today we may have other bases for stories, but having that understanding and not just of the background of the story, but what the implications of the story are huge, right? And those types of things can really touch people and change their lives. And so stories are powerful, right? Just look at the power of having not just a shared story amongst a community or a culture, but of sharing stories. All of this brings people together in a way that I think is amazing. It's just amazing. So, if you haven't gotten the message now, I love stories, but I think humanity in general loves stories. And said, whether it's stories from movies or just friends swapping stories about what happened that one weekend, right? It brings people together. It builds those communities. It strengthens those bonds. That friend group gets closer together because they're telling each other or laughing about that one time, on this weekend. That one time at band camp, I think is a line from American Pie, I think it is. I've never seen the movie. I know that reference, right? Or at least I know where that reference comes from. But it strengthens those bonds and it can help build those connections. So, exit question for you. What do you like about stories? right? Let me know. Drop something in the comments or jump over the Discord and let me know there. But what what is it about stories that you like? And on that note, we'll end it here with another movie reference. Be excellent to each other. And this is Music Free Static signing off.